What Franziska and I will talk about this morning is pretty much the Dublin team's report on training. Just to give you, let's see, there is a website, you've already seen it, where the reports are actually listed. I just want to make one point in advance of what we present. Aidan White is here. Anna mentioned he's one of the external evaluators. Aidan provided a very thorough and very constructive review of our report. He pointed to a number of things that we will change in subsequent weeks. One of our recommendations, in fact, today that we present comes directly from Aidan. So I'm just mentioning this. I encourage everyone to have a look at the report that's on the website, but bear in mind, if you do that, it'll be a different report in maybe about a month's time or 6 weeks' time, because we're going to update that. This is a workshop, so from here on, I want to kill the someone talks up here, everyone down there sits passively and listens. Once Franziska and I finish, we're going to break everyone up into teams and have all you guys debate and discuss the recommendations that the Dublin team has put forward. So we, instead of the conventional yesterday type of thing whereby a paper is presented and then we break for questions, at that point Franziska and Dill are going to take over, put people into groups, we'll arrange the exercise and then have coffee, and we'll come back and get into hopefully some meaty discussion and debate. Okay, just in terms of our approach, was very similar to all the other teams. This gives an idea of kind of overlapping literatures. The Dublin team, we firstly looked at the broader European context, policy papers, codes of conduct, moving into manuals, handbooks, those sorts of things. One thing to say about training, first off, is that it's a subject that receives comparatively little attention in the literature. So training is one of those things that's very often flagged up as a good thing, normatively speaking, and then it's relegated to a list of appendices, typically in a book. So it's often described in quite highly generalized ways, you might say. This means that practical advice and guidelines are typically left to quite a limited number of voluntary manuals and handbooks. Okay, just to give you an impression of some of the key findings that we found from our literature. Diversity policies, overly general and usually lack mechanisms for accountability. Diversity training policies are generally voluntary, so there's a question there about implementation. Policy guidelines focus on narrow occupational groups. Some of these things we'll be picking up in our recommendations. So rather than say a whole of organization approach. Need for diversity training to occur prior to and during professional practice. And that's something that Heike touched on yesterday, the idea of competency as a background being a component of professional development. Training must include cultivating sensitivity to diversity and developing intercultural communicative competence. Migrant background should be treated as an additional competence. Sorry, that's the point I was making about Heike, not as a hindrance or incompetence. How to acknowledge difference without essentializing it. That's from a study of RTE, the public broadcaster here, by Bill Lahan. And he talks about the fact of how the challenge of normalizing the presence of minority workers. Training components should include the input of migrant organizations. So you find that a lot in the literature. And also mainstream media should look to the community sector. In Ireland and elsewhere, near the Near group, Near FM is here in Ireland, have done quite a lot of very good work on diversity training. Okay, Franziska, I'll pass to you to just give some of the findings.
Yeah, thank you, Neil. I just want to go on a little bit more detail about the interview part of our report. And thanks, Anna. You already explained quite a bit of detail on how we conducted the interview, so I'm not going to talk a lot about that now. But just to remind you, we conducted 68 interviews across all the states, the 6 member states involved in this project, and it was between 10 and 15 interviews each. We here, for our report, we broke the interviewees into different occupational groups. So for analysis, and these were 4 occupational groups. So there's senior management, 9 senior management, 23 editorial staff or producers, 31 journalists, and 3 that were from a different group. And just to give you a bit of a more idea, 20 of the organizations that we interviewed people from were public organizations. And the rest was either privately owned or mixed ownerships. So the concept of the interviews was basically that for each theme of the reports that were presented early on, so content, news production, training and recruitment, the questions were set. So we all asked the same set of questions to all interviews. I have to say, I mean, the way we picked up the people that we interviewed wasn't representative necessarily, but it was more a qualitative approach. So before I'm just going to go and present a few graphs, I just want to point out the questions to you. I'm just going to read them, it's a bit boring. So the questions we asked for our thematic area of training, diversity training, and how they received it, was the first question was, have you ever received any kind of diversity training, formal diversity training, either as a student or as a media professional? The second question was, are the opportunities for diversity training in the organization you currently work for? Question 3, does the organization you currently work for have any kind of diversity guidelines or policies in place? Question 4, does your organization monitor, evaluate how guidelines are followed? And then, in your opinion, should media industries, including your own, be making greater efforts to provide diversity training? So these were the basic questions that were asked for a specific thematic focus on diversity training. Yeah, and just before we go into the details of the graphs, I mean, I just kind of present a few kind of top-level findings here anyway. There's more detail in the report. We did break down the answers in 3 categories, which was obviously yes, no, here in green and red, and then there's a middle category as well, because we found there was quite a few interesting answers in a kind of a more grey area that couldn't be kind of like qualify either as no or yes. So I'm going to give you an example for this in a minute. Just to give you a bit of an idea of how answers were kind of spread out across the different member states. This is an example from the Netherlands, and you can see here there's all questions kind of do very well. So there's a lot of training already existence, there's opportunities, there's also policies in place, and then there's quite a bit of monitoring as well. Just to compare this, we have Italy. I'm not going to bash out about Italy, but it's just one of the examples. There's actually quite a few of the countries we looked at that didn't do so well. So I mean, it's basically like the Netherlands and the UK that done fairly well, and the rest was a little bit poorer. Ireland kind of does a bit in the middle, and it's quite interesting to see in Ireland you actually get a lot of the middle answers. So there was a lot of in between, or maybe kind of insecurity about how to, position yourself, or how to actually where to put things, I suppose. Now I'm just going to move on to an overview of all the questions and all the answers. The first graph I want to put your attention to is the graph for question number 1, which asked if people have received formal diversity training. And less than 1/3 of all the interviewees have actually stated that they received formal training. So that's less than 20 people. While the largest number has stated 27 of the 68 people that have never received any type of formal training. However, it was quite interesting that 19 people felt that they had a considerable knowledge of diversity, even though they didn't have received any formal training, which would be, in the education or in-house training seminars. They felt, though, that with living abroad, for example, attending conferences, reading on the topic or discussing the issue, working with people from my background, they did accumulate some sort of knowledge on the issue, and most of them actually felt that that was enough and they didn't need any formal training, and they felt like it would qualify them to work on the issue or be prepared on this anyway. The next, well, no, we stay with the slide. Next question number 2 is was asking for opportunities for training either within the organisation or to see if they would be at least encouraged to attend seminars or workshop outside the organisation. And here you see as well there's a significant lack of opportunities that are offered to the media professionals across all the member states, with of course an exception of the Netherlands and the UK as well. It's quite hard to see that actually in Greece, Italy and Poland there were no opportunities for media professionals at all within their organisations. In Ireland it was a bit mixed. At least they're kind of saying we do attend sometimes outside organisations. Also interesting was that, and maybe not so surprising, that the majority of the organisations that did offer opportunities were publicly owned. So this leads us anyway to the fact that 49 of the organisations that we interviewed people from did not offer any diversity training opportunities. I do want to mention here as well, because it was mentioned by Aidan White to look at a bit of the graphic of the ownership of the media and also the type of media that we looked at. This was kind of the only very distinct result that we could find with the ownership for question 2. All the other questions we did look at it, but we didn't feel like the kind of findings were distinct enough to make a generalization from it, because we have kind of small numbers of interviews in an organization that we look at, and you know, if you look at 12 to 8 to whatever, you can't really make any generalizations from that. Quickly moving on, as you can see from the graph number 3, there is not a lot of policies going on and guidelines in terms of diversity training or how diversity training should be handled in the organizations. And of those who do offer or who do have existing guidelines or policies in place, only 6 actually monitor how they implement these guidelines or evaluate how they're doing anyway. And all these 6 were placed in the UK or the Netherlands. However, there's 6 more that do have kind of some sort of informal look at how they're doing, but you know, not formally doing it. Yeah, so I'm going to hand you back to question number 5 here.
Okay.
Yeah.
Great. Let me. Just the final key. Okay. Yeah. Let me read the actual wording of question 5. In your opinion, should media industries, including your own, be making greater efforts to promote diversity training? The important thing to say about this question is that most people said yes, but it tended to be in quite a qualified way. I think for us, question 5 was very interesting because it captured essentially the range of opinion on diversity training. As a whole, I suppose it paints a rather unclear picture. Answers were often littered with qualifications or caveats, so it kind of blurs the line between those who favour diversity training and those who oppose it. It should be said straight up that most interviewees were of the opinion that it was a good thing. I think that does not come across especially well in our current report. It was, again, a point made by Aidan White that we appreciate, which, you know, the Dublin report perhaps was a little too negative in our rewriting. We'll present it somewhat differently. I think what's important about question 5, and we're honing in here, is that it tells us a lot more than about training in a narrow sense. If you like, discussion about training provided a kind of indirect route into more general views on diversity and the media. So if you like, training for us emerged as a kind of a gateway topic, you might say, through which our informants or interviewees commented on not just training, but they tended to move back and forth between the different thematic areas, recruitment, production, etc. Okay, first off there, a number of interviewees who supported the suggestion of increased diversity training did so on the grounds that I suppose journalists and media organizations in general have a responsibility both to reflect diverse audiences in their textual output, but I suppose also ensure that workforces are ethnically diverse. And we can trace this right back to the likes of the Kerner report in the United States. More recently, 2001, Greg Dyke in the BBC describing it as hideously white. So there's a trajectory there, I suppose. Many of our interviewees commented that European journalism remains, by and large, a white middle-class profession. Journalists remain quite sheltered, is how one of our interviewees put it. Okay, secondly, our findings to this question highlighted the fact that journalism is also a practical craft. While in the first instance, if we see number one there, their arguments were quite ideological to an extent. Most felt an obligation to support diversity goals. On the few occasions when people gave actual concrete examples, the rationale seemed to shift from the ideological to the practical. So an interviewee in Italy, for example, stressed that Italian journalists are generally ignorant of how residence permits function. Okay, thirdly, quite a number of our interviewees talked about the diversification of the workforce. We might say they adopted a kind of a liberal humanist viewpoint. They were generally supportive of diversity in society. A lot of them were skeptical, I have to say, though, about the potential benefits. Several insisted that the only worthwhile measure of diversity should be workforce diversity. I mentioned earlier, and we talked about it a little bit yesterday, recent studies by the likes of Ted Glasser in the United States, which question the extent to which a more ethnically diverse workforce necessarily produces more diverse content. He actually argues for diversity of journalism rather than diversity in journalism, so he makes a distinction. This was very interesting, we thought, find number 4 here. A lot of those who were hostile is perhaps too strong a word, but were certainly hesitant about the potential benefits about training, stressed the importance of professional know-how. So they describe journalism as a craft that works on instinct and intuition, so almost that journalists have a kind of a visceral sense of the job and the story. And for some of them, it made them almost anti-training in general sense. One Irish interviewee said, you know, journalists are very much individualists in how they approach their work, and they recoil at the idea of someone bringing them into a room and saying, this is how you should cover something. Because typically, they don't like to be echoing an agenda. We don't. And if you like, some of them even, their answers even suggested that the very character of journalism might be threatened. So another Irish interviewee said, even if it's good advice, they don't like that. It's kind of in the character, almost in the DNA. Okay, the fifth way of analysing the findings, question 5, we're deprioritizing diversity is how we put it. Several made the point that it's not just diversity training that really needs to be covered. A number of our interviewees actually felt that diversity training should be given a low priority. Many, when answering this question, referred to the current economic climate. So a lot, for example, said, no, we need training on libel and defamation ahead of diversity training. So that required much more immediate attention. Again, I'll give a response from one interviewee. Higher on my agenda would be sort of things like understanding the economic crisis, legal issues, new laws, and so on. That's much more crucial. You know, we could end up closing the newspaper over one of those issues, but getting something wrong in the area of migrants isn't going to bankrupt us. So there's partly an economic logic, obviously, there too. Lastly, we call this the diffusion of responsibility. It goes back to classic communication theory. A number of interviewees were of the opinion that while media organizations have a general responsibility, that diversity training per se is almost beyond the scope of their duties. Several interviewees suggested that other organizations and institutions should be taking the lead here, in particular academic institutions. So universities, if you like, should assume primary responsibility for diversity training. And if you like, the suggestion here is that just as news organizations should be entitled to assume that journalism graduates have internalized principles of good journalism, reporting, balance, some of the things we discussed yesterday, and they should have the requisite skills in news writing, using equipment, etc. They should also be able to assume that graduates have been schooled in diversity issues. So of course this does raise the broader issue of where does responsibility for diversity lie. I mean, again, it goes back to another paper by John McManus entitled Who's Responsible for Journalism? And he talks about the structural ethics, about political economy. McManus argues that journalists have become decision takers rather than decision makers. But at the same time, we can't absolve complete responsibility here. I mean, they're hardly passive automatons. Okay, that's a sense of our findings of question 5. I'm just going to pass you back to Franziska now, who will take you through the concrete recommendations that we had. Thanks a lot.
Thanks, Neil. Yeah, we actually tried to come up with a couple of recommendations that actually can take the findings from this report a bit further and see how we can put a few things into practice or possibilities to do that anyway. And I just want to emphasise that these recommendations are for across the sector and not only for journalists and how they have to use different vocabulary or something, but they do kind of try to go a bit more structural approach and look at the whole organisation. So we would also look at, as well as at media practitioners, at the state bodies, the journalistic associations, and all the other kind of players involved in this area. And I did want to say as well, I mean, across the different member states, you could see earlier a little bit that there's quite significant differences in how training is kind of placed there. And the reasons for that could probably be discussed at another place, which is, whether it's the immigration history or editorial practices or stuff like that. So some of the recommendations might be more valid for some of the countries than the others. So like the first recommendation looks at kind of establishing a forum for information sharing. We did identify the specific problem that there is a poor communication and information sharing about diversity training, in particular between and across newsmaking organizations in Europe. So we do recommend that these newsmaking organizations in each member state should establish a collective forum for exchanging ideas and information about diversity training, which has happened in some way or the other already, but we just want to emphasize that this is a very crucial point, and it could lead to a handbook of practices or sharing practices how to approach this. The next recommendation looks at the diffusion of responsibility that Neil pointed out earlier, that a lot of journalists pointed out in the interviews. Either within the organisation saying, this is a question for HR, I don't have anything to do with diversity, or between media organisations and, for example, universities or other bodies, the idea that that should have been done before the journalists come in to the media outlets. So the recommendations that we put down is that newsmaking organisations in each member state should appoint a specific diversity champion or department within the media organisations, so that the responsibility is not pushed outwards to journalistic bodies or educational institutions, although they obviously have to play a role, as we were talking about yesterday, and also that the responsibility within the organisation is clearer local. The third recommendation looks at the internal communication, in which this department or champion would obviously play a role as well, because we did find that there's a very poor intra-organisational communication on the matters relating to diversity training, whether it be opportunities for diversity training or specific guidelines. So we felt like a lot of journalists, even though we knew, for example, in RTE, that there were while there were attempts to establish cultural, intercultural commitment guidelines and so on, that most people we talked to didn't actually weren't aware of them. So we feel like this internal communication needs to be stronger and should be made available to all the staff, which could be a role that that diversity champion could take on. Another problem that Neil already touched on that we found from the interviews is that a lot of the journalists or the media professionals that we interviewed saw diversity training as kind of extracurricular and not as their responsibility. So we kind of try to recommend that the commitments to diversity should be mainstreamed, and diversity goals should be written into the organizational charters of the organizations. So it wouldn't be as vague as, oh, maybe they should have done something, or, you know, there should be whatever. And we think while diversity training should not necessarily become compulsory, and that probably wouldn't be realistic to ask for anyway, we think it should be recognized as a central rather than peripheral component of professional development and not be pushed out to the side. Sorry. Our fifth problem that we identified is the perception of diversity training as an infringement on journalistic integrity, which is what Neil talked a lot about in the earlier points, that a lot of journalists feel that, you know, you kind of interact with what they should do or not do. And we feel that newsmaking organizations should encourage and facilitate ongoing professional training of their staff. So never mind if they have received training in terms of diversity awareness before they came into the organization, there should be ongoing training facilitated, and it should be considered important as well. And as part of this, diversity awareness should be promoted as a core competence, and that leads back to Heike Graf's presentation yesterday, rather than infringement to journalistic integrity. Finally, no, actually not finally, second last, what I mentioned earlier already is the idea, and thanks to invite you pointed it out as well, that there is a specific lack of commitment in many of the news organizations that we interview people from to invest in resources on building editorial cultures of respect for diversity. So we feel like there's a need for building an editorial culture of respect for diversity, which requires a whole organization approach. So it's not about the journalists who should use particular words or ask for specific people, but this needs to be a structural change in the media organizations, and especially from management level, to implement and recognize the importance of diversity training. So it does require firm commitments from senior management. And I mean, this might be particularly relevant because only, I have it here somewhere, but I think of all the 9 proper management people we've interviewed, only 2 or 3 actually received diversity training, which is, shows you as well that they mightn't even have it on their agenda. Right, the last one is just obviously that we always recommend to have this monitored and evaluated on an ongoing basis. Okay, so I think that's it from part of our presentation of our findings and the recommendations.